Mobilization, draft dodgers, deserters, father-son conflicts, true patriots, and traitors. Let's take a look at how all this looked in American historical settings. More than half a century ago, more than 2.5 million Americans took part in the Vietnam War, of whom over 58,000 died and hundreds of thousands returned with injuries and trauma. The longer the conflict in Vietnam lasted, the less support it received among the United States population, and the larger the anti-war movement became. When, on April 28, 1967, a draft board official in Houston, Texas, called out the name Cassius Clay several times, no one responded. The man known worldwide as Muhammad Ali showed not the slightest desire to step forward for a medical examination and induction into the United States Army. The officer warned the undisputed heavyweight champion of the world that he was committing a criminal offense and threatened him with prosecution. Ali replied that he understood the seriousness of the situation, but still refused to participate in the draft. A few minutes later, the popular athlete stepped outside, squinting slightly at the flashes of cameras, and addressed the reporters who had gathered around him. As a devout Muslim, my conscience and conviction compel me to express my position. By refusing to be drafted into the Army, I realized that if I went there, I would not be able to remain a sincere follower of my religion. Later that same day, the sports commissions of several states stripped Ali of his professional license even before he was officially recognized as a draft dodger. And in the following months, the boxer became one of the most hated public figures in the country. Politicians, journalists, and ordinary Americans accused him of refusing to fulfill his duty to his country and lacking patriotism. However, Ali did not take back his words even after he became a national outcast. 3 months after the incident at the draft board, Muhammad Ali was found guilty of refusing to comply with the lawful order of the Selective Service to be drafted. The boxer filed an appeal, but the United States Supreme Court overturned his conviction only 2 years later, in June 1971. Muhammad Ali is just a prominent name from a long list of those who refused to serve in Vietnam. The boxer showed his political and ideological stance through his actions. For many other Americans, the unwillingness to go to war was connected not only with moral or religious beliefs, but also with fear for their own lives. Thousands of young people did not want to die or to kill. For the sake of populist slogans they did not support, draft dodgers came up with various ways to avoid going to the front, from faking mental illnesses to fleeing to Canada. Here are the words of one of the draft dodgers, John Lacey. "Was I a coward? Did I let my country down? In a sense, you could call me a coward because I chose to leave rather than go to jail for refusing to serve," John Lacey reflected. "But I wasn't afraid to fight. I refused to serve in Vietnam because we had no right to be there. We only brought suffering and destruction to that country. We acted like bullies and used all our military power against a nation of peasants." Some might say that I'm not in a position to judge what happened in Vietnam. However, many veterans who fought there hated the war just as much as I did. I was deeply troubled by the actions of the government. The authorities lied to justify what they did and spent millions on bombings. While the problems in our cities were getting worse, the Vietnam War left a deep scar on my country. John Lacey was born in 1945 and grew up in New York. And in 1967, right after graduating from college, he left the United States for Canada to avoid the draft. After some time, he moved to Sweden and returned from there. Only in 1977, when President Jimmy Carter pardoned all draftees who had been accused of desertion and draft evasion during the Vietnam War. As things got tougher for Americans in Vietnam, they became more active and joyful. Canadians welcomed draft dodgers, newspapers wrote about them, and television reported on them. The fugitives from the States and the Canadians who took them in agreed that they considered the war immoral, and that refusing to participate in it was a moral necessity. However, the relationship between Americans hiding from the draft and the Canadians who took them in was far from always perfect. Here are some examples of such quotes. "I don't like draft dodgers, and I'll do everything possible within the law to get rid of them. said Vancouver Mayor Tom Campbell. Toronto Mayor William Dennison agreed. Hippies and deserters are our only problem. However, in many ways, it was precisely this kind of radical stance by officials that forced the authorities to take a clear position on the issue of immigrants from the States. On May 22, 1969, Canada's Minister of Manpower and Immigration, Alan MacEachin, announced that Americans who opposed the war and the draft would be granted residency. Before that, the legal status of draft dodgers in a foreign country remained unclear. Some were lucky, while others were turned back at the border and sent back to the States. The situation changed due to the stance of several respectable parliamentarians, who believed that Canada would be acting servilely if it refused to admit American deserters out of fear of worsening relations with its neighbors. In the following decades, Americans who settled in Canada formed the backbone of various political and social movements. Some were so eager to fit in with locals that they promoted nationalist ideas themselves. Canadians in the 1970s often noted that the most radical chauvinists were usually of American origin. This tendency was explained by the foreigners' desire to integrate into society and by a sense of gratitude to the country that took them in during a time of discord with their homeland. Americans in Canada actively raised issues of ecology and global warming, advocated for the abandonment of nuclear weapons even in the 21st century, supported modern draft dodgers, and criticized the authorities of various countries for new wars. While in the United States, the conservative wing radicalized and strengthened in response to the leftist movement of the 1960s in Canada. Pacifists and supporters of humanistic values felt more free. A significant contribution to the liberalization of Canada's domestic policy was made by the immigrants of the Vietnam War and those who protested against it. Events in Vietnam during the late 1960s sparked major protests in the United States, Canada, and Japan. There, one form of protest against violence was helping American soldiers who wanted to avoid being sent to the front. Most of these servicemen tried to find ways to get to Sweden, the only European country outside the socialist bloc that agreed to grant deserters humanitarian asylum. According to the United States Department of Defense, between July 1, 1966 and December 31, 1973, 503,926 soldiers refused to perform military service, a huge number compared to 50,000 people during the Second World War and 13,790 people in the Korean War, which ended in 1953. Most of this 500,000 draft dodgers went on the run. In America, far fewer soldiers deserted directly in Vietnam or in other Asian regions. Among the latter, Japan stood out in particular, since there were more than 10 American military bases operating in that country from which conscripts escaped. However, the existing immigration laws did not allow them to seek asylum. Moreover, after they left the unit to which they were assigned, local police had the right to arrest them for illegally staying on Japanese territory. And yet, some deserters managed to achieve their goal. They either stayed in Japan and went into hiding, or escaped the country on their own using forged documents. In the fall of 1967, Japanese activists from the anti-war movement called the Citizens Peace League for Vietnam began to help American servicemen. This organization specialized in various forms of protest, from sit-in strikes in front of the American government in Tokyo to developing secret routes that would allow foreign soldiers to disappear from the view of local authorities and their own command. On October 23, the Capital Branch of this league received information about 4 American sailors who went absent without leave when their aircraft carrier docked at the port of Yokosuka. 5 days later, Japanese pacifists sheltered the deserters, and 2 weeks after that, they transported them to Yokohama and got them aboard a Soviet ship bound for the city of Nakodka. After the sailors had already escaped, their statement was published, in which the young men spoke out against what was happening in Vietnam and criticized the United States authorities for increasing military power in Asia. The deserters, the oldest of whom was 20 years old, were nicknamed the Fearless Four. The Soviet authorities, having previously guaranteed the Japanese pacifists humane treatment of the fugitives, fulfilled their obligations and released the sailors to Europe. A couple of months after their escape, the Fearless Four arrived in Sweden. Over the next year, the League members perfected the system and helped several dozen more deserters escape. First to the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, and then to Sweden. One of the reasons Japanese pacifists couldn't help more deserters was the caution of the Soviet Union. The authorities feared a spy could infiltrate the draft dodgers. The route was indeed compromised by an undercover American agent. While searching for new underground routes, the soldiers had to remain hidden for a long time from other American military personnel and Japanese authorities. This led to the organization effectively freezing its activities. However, it was far from the only force in Japan that opposed a military conflict involving the United States on its continent. On October 21, 1968, activists declared it International Anti-War Day and held events across the country. The climax. When students blocked Tokyo Station with a train ready to deliver aviation fuel to the American base in Yokohama, about 700 people were detained in the capital and nearby areas that day for joining unauthorized rallies. The mass arrests sparked new protests around the world. In France, President Charles de Gaulle even threatened striking workers with martial law. In Japan, students blocked universities until the beginning of '69, when police in helicopters bombarded the protesters with tear gas grenades. In the clashes, 270 students and 710 law enforcement officers were injured, and 400 civilians were arrested. The generation gap was another deep problem in American society at that time, intensified by the war, pacifism, and hatred toward the American government. Young people were considered by their parents to be engaging in naive rebellion. Young Americans who didn't leave the country and protested against the Vietnam War were harshly criticized by conservative politicians and public figures. Supporters of the Asian campaign considered themselves true patriots and fighters against the war of communism, while their ideological opponents were seen as ungrateful traitors. Among some members of the military, the theory of a stab in the back was spreading. They attributed the failures of the American Army not to the resistance of the enemy, but to sabotage and desertion by the Fifth Column. So, alongside the Vietnam War, another war unfolded in America, between young people and the old men who run this country. In addition to numerous celebrities, from Muhammad Ali to musician Bob Dylan, thousands of young Americans declared their disagreement with the actions of the authorities. For the generation that lived through World War II and often considers frontline experience the main criterion of manliness, they remained merely susceptible to Soviet propaganda. Troublemakers, you could say, even foreign agents. Some conscripts went on the run and hid from mobilization in remote areas, while others openly protested against state-sanctioned military aggression, even if such behavior threatened them with prison time or being sent to the front. In 1964, the first mass burning of draft cards took place, and in 1967, activist David Harris inspired like-minded people to send their draft cards back to the draft board with letters explaining that young Americans did not want to participate in violence. "Some called me a draft dodger, but I wasn't dodging anything," explained Harris. "I wasn't hiding from the consequences. In response to the truth I spoke, I was ordered to report to the military unit, using bureaucratic loopholes to delay this visit. I helped found the Resistance, a movement that organized acts of civil disobedience. We lived in a car, traveled to campuses, gave speeches, and searched for those outraged by the evil affecting our people. Harris's group advised anyone who wanted help with the draft, whether they planned to evade conscription or intended to report when summoned. Activists handed out leaflets in front of military enlistment offices and urged the young men who came there to go home, hid draft dodgers, and stole archives with personal data. In January '68, Harris was arrested for refusing to comply with a requirement under the conscription law. At the hearing months later, the judge refused to allow the defendant's speech on how the war conflicted with his morals into the case. Harris was one of 3,250 Americans sentenced to actual prison terms for refusing to serve in Vietnam. Muhammad Ali, who remained free while his appeal was being considered, although he could not participate in professional boxing, also became one of the unofficial leaders of the anti-war movement. The athlete traveled around the country and told students why he decided to refuse service, despite accusations and harassment. Ali recalled that some saw him as a hero. Some said that I was doing the wrong thing. But everything I did according to my conscience. I wasn't trying to be a leader. I just wanted to preserve freedom. I spoke on behalf of all people, not just black people, about the need to think about your actions. The government created a system where the son of a wealthy man goes to college and gets a deferment, while the son of a poor man goes to war. After graduating from college, the son of a wealthy man would find other ways to extend his deferment until he no longer had to go to war. Among the draftees, there were many who didn't publicly oppose the war, but tried to be declared unfit for service. Some young men talked about having special thoughts or faked mental disorders, while others refused to eat for several days and turned into living skeletons with skin stretched over their bones, all for the coveted mark in their file. One draft dodger went into the mountains and lived as a hermit in a treehouse for 6 years. The northeastern regions of New England were nicknamed Little Canada because so many young men hid from the army in the dense local forests. In 1973, the army became contract-based. In 1974, President Ford announced partial amnesty for draft dodgers. In 1975, the war ended. However, even in the mid-1970s, many conservative Americans condemned the war not because it was immoral and destroyed thousands of their fellow citizens' lives, but because their country was unable to win. Most citizens stopped supporting the war not because they realized it was a mistake, but because the whole enterprise turned out to be a hopeless failure. One way or another, in the public consciousness, the Vietnam War turned from an ideological struggle for the future of humanity into a tragedy for different nations and individual people. Draft dodgers were once seen as cowards, but later viewed as those strong enough to oppose a violent state.